the weaknesses of every land vehicle unit in Noobs in Combat and how to use them. Unlike most other unit trees, the land vehicles are very diverse in weaknesses. A situation that would be a death sentence for one land vehicle, another land vehicle somewhere would excel in it. So it's important to know which ones can survive in what types of said situations. The basic anti-tank gun is meant for defending territory against armored units, but is completely useless against infantry, especially large groups of them. It completely lacks armor, so any machine gun will shred it, which, isn't a good thing. I recommend keeping some kind of anti-infantry unit with an anti-tank gun at all times, just because of how weak it is against them. The tank destroyer rids itself of nearly all the weaknesses of the anti-tank gun, but in turn costs more than twice as much as it. Its armor stops most infantry from being a threat and is backed up by its machine gun. It also has more mobility, so it can reposition or escape easier. I recommend only using them in key locations you really need to defend due to their high price not allowing you to have nearly as many. The recoilless rifle has amazing firepower and a low price, but comes riddled with weaknesses. Like the anti-tank gun, it is incredibly vulnerable to infantry and should be protected from them whenever you can. Fortunately, since its firepower is so great, it is a lot easier to justify protecting a recoilless rifle. The missile tank and half-track may be very effective against single very powerful vehicles and many infantry, but are still weak to large groups of vehicles. The main issue is the lack of ammo reserve and the fact that it simply can't attack all the enemies by itself if there are enough of them. However, if a supply unit is nearby and it has a little extra backup, the missile tank will probably be fine. The anti-air gun is very effective against aerial units, infantry, and even light vehicles, but poses absolutely no threat to medium or heavily armored units. I highly recommend keeping something that can deal with them nearby, but this can be difficult since things that can defend against highly armored units usually cost a lot. The anti-air truck isn't much more expensive than the anti-air gun because it's still very vulnerable to heavily or medium armored vehicles. However, the mobility and armor does mean it really doesn't have to worry about getting overwhelmed by infantry, which the anti-air gun might if by itself. Also, you're more likely to come in contact with enemies when using the anti-air truck, since it's mostly used for offense rather than defense, as it can protect your army from planes as they move. The anti-air cannon is relatively vulnerable to infantry while being able to defend itself from vehicles and planes very effectively. The main thing you want to worry about is that it is completely unable to escape due to being towed only. Honestly, it's a pretty solid anti-air unit for defense and may be even better than the SPAG when you don't need to protect too much ground. The SPAG can be an absolute one-tapping powerhouse, but can also get one-tapped itself pretty easily. A battle tank, an RPG, another SPAG, or anything with similar firepower can insta-kill your SPAG, which is a huge problem due to its very high price of 130 ticks. As tempting as it may be to run into enemy territory with your prized SPAG, I highly recommend sending in other units first to both trigger any ambush perks or just get info. Honestly, you might want to just not use your SPAG for pushing at all, since its death would likely make you completely vulnerable to any aerial unit. The supply wagon will get one-tapped by pretty much anything, but since it's so cheap, anything being able to hit it at all shouldn't be a problem. I say that because as long as you competently defend it, you should have enough money to do so. However, if you're playing PvP, it's super weak to fighter or fighter jets, as they can just run in, one-tap it, and leave if there isn't any anti-air nearby. The supply truck is a bit less risky to have in contested territory since it can survive being attacked by bullets and has great mobility. The mobility also means it can get back to HQ to resupply much faster, which means it can support the units protecting it faster as well. Just keep an eye on the armored vehicles or RPGs that might pose a threat to it. The supply carrier has quite a bit more armor and more supplies, which makes it a lot less vulnerable. Honestly, the supply carrier's greatest threat is enemy artillery or heavily armored units. It also should be noted that it will take a lot longer to get supplies due to its limited mobility and lack of tires. The biker is weak to nearly everything in the game that manages to get a shot on it, but its main threat is anything with the ambush perk. Stuff without the perk might one-tap it, but only after getting shot and having artillery called on them, where units with the perk can just kill it without consequence. The scout car is great for charging into territory filled with enemy infantry, but is constantly at risk of finding an RPG, or anything else with armor. The lack of defense against armor can be dealt with by having powerful artillery, but that's assuming that the scout car isn't killed by something with the ambush perk first. Unfortunately, for everything in the biker tree, it is quite difficult to know where ambushed units are without already getting killed by them. The autocar and its variants all excel in fighting one kind of unit while also having a radio, but excluding the armored car, TD, they are once again super vulnerable to the ambush perk. The autocar is great for charging enemy infantry and sometimes lightly armored units. The heavy car is good for charging light to medium armored units with a little bit of infantry defense, and the armored car TD is good for watching enemy movements and destroying medium armored units as it does so. Unfortunately, all three of them are weak to effectively anything I didn't explicitly mention. The Recon car is very good for calling in artillery strikes while keeping itself alive, but as usual is deathly terrified of the ambush perk. When it is ambushed, it effectively makes multi-move useless, which is definitely saying something. Honestly, this might be the only unit in the game that wouldn't exactly be weak to anything if it wasn't for that perk. However, it is the hardest to kill out of the whole three, so it's at least a little better at surviving that stuff. In any case, I think the Recon car is at its best and safest when retaking territory you've lost, since the ambush perk units haven't had time to properly set up. Remember that stuff about how the Recon car could theoretically be the only weaknessless unit in the game with the right playstyle? Well, it's actually got some unsuspected competition. The transport truck has absolutely no weaknesses when used correctly. Due to its infinite fuel and the fact that it has no use on the battlefield, you should never actually lose it as long as you're playing safe. Though it's generally easy to one-tap, as long as your actual army doesn't have massive holes, the supply truck should be able to transport infantry and towed artillery without any problems. The half-track and its variants are typically used to transport units through somewhat dangerous territory, which means they themselves need to be kept safe. All of them, excluding half-track TD, can be quite easily killed by armored units, so you might want to accompany them with something that isn't weak to armored units, to just really make sure they get to the main battlefield safely. Of course, the reverse is true with a half-track TD or even CS, where you might want to instead bring something that can fight infantry. The APC or wheeled APC are very safe ways of transporting units if you are already doing an artillery strategy, but aren't usually worth using otherwise. Without artillery, there is just no way for them to fight armored units, and you might as well be using a cheaper transportation unit that doesn't need artillery, like a half-track variant. The IFV is an unbelievably safe way of transporting units, but is very expensive and can't carry as much. The main issue with the IFV is that you won't be able to buy as many actual units for your army due to its expensive price. However, if you can get around that, the IFV is very likely the way to go, since it has a way of dealing with every unit in the game that could pose a safety risk to its transportation. Predictably, the tankette is quite weak against armored units, but unlike most similar units, it's not quite as weak to RPGs. This is due to its extended machine gun range, which makes it exceptional for killing infantry for the price. Of course, it is completely useless against armor, so it's best in isolated scenarios where you know you need to kill a lot of infantry. The scout tank is just a better tankette for a higher price. Instead of just infantry, it can also defend itself against other lightly armored units. Just make sure to continue being careful with it, since it's not much harder to one-tap than the tankette. However, due to the decreased number of weaknesses, as long as you have the money, there are a lot more scenarios where it's a good pick. The light tank is decent for defending against other armored units and infantry, but is best when playing a support role for a more expensive unit. It needs something else to take the hits, since it itself is highly vulnerable to anything with any real amount of power. Speaking of which, the Recon tank is just that, but exemplified. It's almost as easy to destroy as the light tank, but with a much more powerful attack and the ability to call in artillery. While it's also best as a support role, it can do that much more efficiently as long as you don't get overconfident with its abilities. The multi-L tank is crazy good for getting rid of infantry, but is relatively expensive and just can't fight armor. With its multi-attack that has increased range, you don't need to worry about the RPG very often, but it's super important to keep any armored units away from it. Also, be wary of infantry with radios, as they can easily call in something to cripple the multi-L tank. The multi-M tank honestly has very few weaknesses, but as usual can be deleted with enough sheer power. It is great for fighting large numbers of units, but can start to struggle when there are multiple powerful armored ones. The optimal fight is multiple infantry in one armored unit, but that's not always the case. The multi-H tank is only weak to specifically anti-tank units, since it is ridiculously hard to overwhelm. Of course, with enough firepower, the enemy can destroy it with anything, but typically you just want to worry about the really hard-hitting stuff, as long as the rest of your army army is competently used. Though it might not be great for offense due to its mobility and constant need for supplies, I am of the opinion that the multi-H tank is actually better for defense than the battle tank itself. The medium tank is similar to the multi-M tank, a good direct support unit, but is worse at defending against infantry. Really, you would want to use it if you want the same benefits as the multi-M tank and you don't need to deal with large groups of infantry. Other than that, it's just generally pretty bad by itself, so make sure it's support and not your main pushing force. Similar to the dynamic between the medium and multi-M tank, the heavy tank is basically just the multi-H tank when you don't have to worry about specifically being overwhelmed by large numbers of enemies. It's quite powerful, but since they are the same price, it doesn't have much going for it when compared to the multi-H tank. Also, for both of them and the battle tank, RPGs become a massive issue when attacking since they are so cheap for how much damage they can do to heavy armor. The battle tank is basically the heavy tank with every number, including the price, slightly raised. It's faster, stronger, and expensive. Honestly, when it comes to weaknesses, the battle tank doesn't have much other than RPGs and the lack of supporting units due to its price. Thanks for watching until the end of the video. I'm attempting to make 2 videos a week, so it's been a lot of work, but by the numbers on my channel, it looks like I'm making good progress. Anyway, make sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.